Well, this is going to be an interesting one today. I've got my Octave CAT and I've got Jim Heywood in the States has sent me a video of him playing with his Octave CAT as well. So I'm going to try and match the two of them. I've got a laptop next to me with his video on it and we're going to try and play what he's playing, replicate it on the Behringer, or Behringer, however you want to say it. So it's an intercontinental collaboration to see if this sounds anything like a vintage unit. And before we start, you know, this is sort of going to bring to a head, I feel, the fact that vintage units have all sorts of little drift in them. Jim's already mentioned that it's got a bit of glide going on with his, even though glide's down at 0. So there's going to be all those sort of little sort of tiny differences that some people may say, well, it doesn't sound anything like a vintage unit. Like they did with the Mini Moog re-release. Doesn't sound like my 40-year-old vintage Mini Moog. Of course it doesn't. But, you know, it's not about do they sound exactly the same as everyone says. And if you get two units next to each other, they don't sound exactly the same either. So I think with these, it's, does it have the same sort of feel, the same sort of character as the vintage unit? Because let's face it, it's not going to be identical, and neither would two vintage cats. And another thing just to pull out is that the model Jim's got is slightly different in that it looks like it's got triangles and not sine on the LFOs. It is a slightly different revision, and it doesn't have the option of ADSR on the pulse width. Plus it's only got sync off or on, it hasn't got the additional mode A as well. But as far as I'm aware, they didn't change the design of the oscillators. The setup's the same, the envelope should be the same, the filter's the same. Or should be the same. So just before we start, I'll just go through the quick highlights. Triangle sounds different on this. It's a bit smoother. It's a bit more buzzy on the original. The pulse on the original that Jim's got has a sort of a lower range. It doesn't go quite to 50% or up to sort of the 95, whatever this is. VCO1 can go slower on this sort of LFO mode. The LFO can go a bit slower on the vintage. Fine tune's got a higher range on the vintage. This only goes up and down about 9 semitones, maybe 10, whereas on the original it's going up 9, or it's going up a whole octave just by going a quarter. So there's obviously a lot more range in that, which gives you more control over tuning up and down the octaves. I've got the odd sync thing on this with the strange crackles that you get, that you might have seen on one of my other videos. Filter sounds the same, and all the modulation works as you'd expect. And you can go into some really freaky places, and it's not until you're modulating this with this and that with that, and playing the filter and tuning all sorts of things to different things that it becomes difficult to keep control and emulate what you're doing on the vintage one. And that could just be minor differences in tuning on FM and stuff like that. But in general, does this feel like playing a CAT? I think it does. Does it sound good? I think it does. Are you going to watch the rest of the video? I hope you are. It's quite interesting, and it took me ages, so please do. And if you do like it, do think about subscribing. Okay, so first off, let's check out the oscillators. Okay then, so starting off with Sawtooth on VCO1. And you'll notice on the oscilloscope, they're really strange looking Sawtooths, aren't they? Whereas the Behringer look a little bit more like you'd expect. So maybe 40 years of deterioration coming into play here. So they really do sound similar, even though they look completely different on that oscilloscope. So that's interesting. Now moving on to the triangle. And that's where you'll hear a little bit of glide on the original creeping in. But also what I'm noticing is that the Behringer is smoother. It hasn't got that little sort of, that fizz on the top end. It's a lot smoother on the Behringer, that, isn't it? So that doesn't play anything. That's the lowest one we can go to. So real difference in tone there with that one. And one thing I do notice on the Behringer is that little click. I know I mentioned it a lot on the Poly D. But that's such an amazing bass tone. It's a shame you just can't take that off without losing a bit of the attack. But hey ho, the Behringer's got a much smoother tone, hasn't it, on the triangle, and the original's got a lot more sort of fizz and sparkle, or I don't know what you call it, but fizzle do. So moving over to the square now, Jim's put his on his thinnest pulse width, but on this it's so much thinner. So it's equivalent on the older one to about just after 2 o'clock, 2:30 maybe. Let's have a listen. And listening to that, the Behringers go into a 50-50, so you're getting that sort of fluty tone, sort of a hollow tone. You're not getting that on the original. So the original's going from about, I don't know what's that, 7 o'clock. To about just after 2:30, as I say on this. Whereas this, if it goes full, we go from a fluty. So you get much more range on the Behringer, and I'm about 100% convinced that's to do with aging components. Although Jim's has been recapped, it's been serviced, but these things do deteriorate, they change over time, they bring out a character all of their own, don't they? So if you've got a 40-year-old Mini Moog or a 40-year-old Cat or a 40-year-old Odyssey, it will sound different to everyone else's, and it will have, for you, it'll have a character. If you've owned it for that many years, you will love the character of that synth, even though they're all slightly different. And you'll notice again the curvature on the readings on the oscilloscope as well. It's not a square, it's got that sort of scoop to it as well, just like the Sawtooth did. So that's completely different tone again. As I say, it's about this on 7 o'clock, on the first indent here. Indent marking. So keeping within these little parameters here, it's probably got about half the amount, just over half the amount of play on the pulse width as the Behringer, the original. So now let's do a little bit of pulse width modulation. It's really hard to play with the note priority. Similar sounding. I am noticing that I'm having to change the VCA level actually for the different voices to keep it at the same level as the original. Whether that's the Behringer being at different volumes or the original. Let's have a quick listen to that. Yeah, I think maybe the original's just got slightly different levels coming out each of the oscillators. there's slightly different change in tone here, and I think that's obviously because the Behringer is going from a 50% to halfway. But because the original isn't going all the way down to 50%, you're getting... So because the pulse width doesn't go to 50 on the original, you are going to get different tones. A slightly more fluty sound on the Behringer. But it's still got the overall feel, hasn't it? That's 100% on the original, 100% pulse width modulation. And you can hear this has got much more modulation, hasn't it? So all in all, very similar. The triangles are definitely different, but on the square, I think the years have taken the toll on the amount of pulse width variation you're getting on the original. And the triangle's definitely buzzier on the original as well. But overall, playing along, just trying to copy what he's doing, it's acting in the same way. Now looking at the subs. Sounds the same. And there you can hear that the sub-octave's got a sort of perfect square, just like the Behringer does, but the pulse width, or the pulse, doesn't go down to a perfect square. So the two squares sound the same, are on the original and on the Behringer. The square on VCO2 is a perfect square on this, as it is on the original. It's just this one on the original just seems to have degraded a little bit. And the oscillator shapes on the original have got that sort of strange curve to them, haven't they? Moving on to the tuning of oscillator 1 then. Going to maximum. Not quite hitting the same on the Behringer. And going from top to bottom. So we're getting a much more range on the coarse tuning from the original than we are on the Behringer. And Jim asked me just to play around with these tunings here. He's done something where he's sort of playing around with the coarse on this to knock it down an octave, then with the fine tune to bring it back into play with this one to knock that down an octave as well. So let's just hear what he's done. And then he brings this one down to the same. But this one won't do that. This will only go down from a C all the way down to a D. So we're getting 10 semitones. Whereas as Jim plays his, he gets it to about, I don't know, about halfway really, halfway through the turn before he's an octave below. So slight difference there. So we can't quite get there on this. You can knock that up a couple of tones to get to the same effect. But of course now I'm a tone high. So I'm a little bit out of tune with him, but they're behaving the same, except for this tune here, this fine tune. It's only getting half amount of play as you're getting on the original. So using the triangle as a sub, put VCO1 an octave below VCO2. Of course, I can't take this up 2 octaves because the fine tune hasn't got enough range. So we're not getting as much range, and because the triangle sounds different, it does have a completely different tone to the original here. So yeah, that's a difference there. If you're used to having an octave cat, and that's a trick you used to do using this as a sub octave and this a couple of octaves higher, not going to work. And if you look at the original there, that twisted up to an octave higher is only at 3 o'clock. It's only a quarter turn. So it's quite a lot of difference. So that's Jim playing 3 octaves below. Okay, so back in tune, 2 octaves difference. So you can do 3 octaves on the cat, but you can't do it the same way as you do it in the Octave CAT. If you get my drift. It can be done, but you just got to do it in a different way. Let's have a look at sync then. I'm not hearing that clicking in the originals. I'm not hearing those sort of weird artifacts. I'll play them again. So there's none of that clicking. Let's try it with the LFO then. Let's have a listen to the original. So that's what I'd expect, and listening to this one again. So if you keep VCO1 sort of quite high up here, it's quite smooth, but as soon as it comes down, it might sort of modulate close to the frequency of oscillator 2. You get all that weird sort of crackling. I think Dave Spears from G-Force has got a video up of his, and his is doing a slight crackle around here, but nothing to the extent the Behringer's doing. Well, let's have a go at that. That sounds nice, doesn't it? No, it's just nowhere near as smooth. So using the ADSR to modulate it as well. Let's click that into there. Let's just have another listen to the original, shall we? Because I think it is nicer. Just a shame it's not smooth, and I don't know why it isn't. Okay, moving on to the filters. I'm moving on to the resonance now. Let's see if we can match it up with the original. Let's try that. You'll notice the LFO on the Behringer is a bit faster actually than the octave. Let's try that. So I'm getting very much the same sounds out of it, I think. It sounds very much like it's the same filter, just being modulated quicker, slightly quicker by the Behringer. So just trying to track the keyboard with the filter. I've got it set up now, but it does take quite a while because you'll notice on the original you've got 1 volt per octave at the maximum setting, so it works, just twist up full and you've got perfect tracking. On this, it goes much higher than that, so you've got to try and balance the actual tuning and the spread per octave to get it right. So it's a bit of a faff, but it works. So just trying to copy what Jim's already done. So slightly different tones here once you start messing around with any keyboards, obviously, any synths. Minor adjustments when you're doing stuff like this really does make a difference, but it's whether it gets the same feel. It's just slightly out of tune, isn't it? And just really rasping. So you're getting that sort of noisy raspiness. But not exactly the same. I'm slightly out of tune as well. I've tried to tune this as best I can along with the vintage one, but the vintage one's drifting slightly. So every time I come back and try and get them level for one of these little sections. Now look how difficult that is on one that's twice as long, but pretty good, I think. Now let's modulate the filter with VCO1. So let's see what we've got on the vintage. Pretty close, that, isn't it? You wouldn't get anything that close with this sort of modulation going on with a synth that wasn't the same, really, because don't forget we've got VCO2 playing, we've also got the filter that's being tracked as well, and then both being modulated by VCO1. Now, that's not exactly the same, is it? But you're in the same sort of ballpark. So the audio rate's tuned to the oscillator, and then we've got some LFO as well, so let's just double check that. It does have a different tone though, doesn't it? Sort of harsher, I suppose, or sharper. Not quite as meaty, I don't think. Could be a thing with age. Or just slight tuning discrepancies, as in this one's holding its tuning a little bit better. So now I'm modulating VCO2 with VCO1 as well. So VCO1's modulating VCO2 and the filter's also being modulated by the LFO. Definitely the same ballpark. And again, phase differences, things drifting in and out, but the tones are in there, aren't they? So, trying to use VCO1 as an LFO now. So interesting, as he's playing the Sawtooth, it's playing a ramp, it's going low to high, isn't it? Whereas this is going high to low. And the LFOs, oh, not the LFO, sorry, the course tune on this doesn't go quite as low as it does on the original. So obviously we can do the same sort of thing, but it's not going to sound the same. So mixing them. course, it's not going to sound the same with this dropping and the original rising, but the same sort of effect. So you get those lovely little sort of arpeggiator effects. So very, very similar. Only difference being really I can't do it as slow as you can do it on the vintage. So adding a bit of LFO modulation to the cutoff as well. Oh, that's cool. Let's see if we can do that here. Yep, similar. Although this does say, as I said earlier, it's got a sine and not a triangle, so that rhythm will be different. But the effect's the same. Yeah, I'm really quite surprised how close I'm getting them with just messing about with this incredible amount of modulation that's happening actually. It's all gone a bit into sort of noisiness, hasn't it? So I don't know, I'd have to sort of follow that closer, or maybe just can't do it. Oh, he switched VCO1 on and I didn't notice. So I think I'm losing the ability to keep up there, just because every minor tweak when you're using anything like FM just can make such a huge difference to the sound. So without having them both next to me and doing something like I did with the Pro 1, where literally tuning the FM, it's really difficult to get them identical. But I'm feeling that when I'm playing with this, it's not quite as bitey as the original. I'm not getting the similar sort of tones that Jim's getting. Well, I hope that was interesting to somebody somewhere. Thanks very much to Jim for taking part in this and for letting us have a listen to his original. But does it act like an original? Yes, I think it does. Is it identical to the original? No, it's not. I mean, I played with the envelopes and stuff like that in one of my other videos, and somebody else has mentioned that the envelopes are a bit different. My main concern really is the sync. It just got that sort of really weird crackle. I mean, it could make an interesting effect, but it wasn't doing it on the vintage. So in conclusion, it's similar. You get similar tones. You can feel like you're acting in the same way, it acts in the same way as the original. It doesn't sound identical. The triangle's different. The pulse width was, but that could be just because the 40-year-old machines sort of got a bit of degradation in there. We've got the filters to sound identical, and the wave shapes, other than the triangle, sounded really good. The fine tune on the Behringer doesn't have the range that it's got on the original, and the LFO's not as slow on the Behringer. So minor differences. And if we picked up another vintage one, I wonder if there'd be the same differences or different differences. Quite interesting to find out. But no, I'm not going to do another test with another one. I hope that was of some use to somebody somewhere. I hope that was of interest to you. And if it was, please subscribe. And if you've subscribed already, please maybe take a look at my Patreon page. It's really useful, really helpful for the channel so that I can keep on bringing things in and getting rid of things and testing things out for you. And if you're into programming your synths, there's a whole series that I'm creating there, teaching you how to program pretty much any synth, any subtractive synth, looking at all the different sort of sections of a synthesizer, how they all fit together and the similarities they get in loads of synths. So pick up anything, start programming from scratch and put away those presets. Anyway, see you next time.